Some of the most desirable and exciting locations to visit are those that are hard to get to. Whether that be the summits of mountains or isolated islands in the middle of the ocean. With the right planning and preparation, these places can all be visited though, which can take some of the attraction away from some people. There's something about places you cannot visit that makes them even more attractive than even the most picturesque beach. But normally, these places are forbidden for good reason. They may be dangerous for you and for others, or there might be religious or spiritual reasons that limit the visits to only a few. Number 5. In southern Australia, there lies a land roughly the same size as England or Louisiana that's completely devoid of human life. Part of the reason for that is the harsh conditions of the Australian desert. But even those that once called this area home were moved away due to top-secret testing that still goes on to this day. The area is known as the Woomera Range Complex. A woomera is a device used by Aboriginal Australians for throwing spears. It extends the distance a spear can be thrown. It was deemed a fitting name for the rockets and war materials testing range. In the mid-1940s, the UK was concerned about the launch of German V-2 rockets, and figured it needed rockets of its own to answer Germany and whatever threats may come next. This wasn't the sort of thing that the UK had the space to test though, at least not on home soil. The government tried to arrange tests in Canada and the US, but were turned down. When Australia was asked, the Prime Minister approved the request. Australia is known for its wide-open, sparsely populated interior. 18% of the Australian mainland is desert, but as much as 35% is desert-like. Even though rainfall looks high on paper, the evaporation is so high that water is hard to come by. The arid, flat land seemed like the perfect place to set up the testing range, and the Anglo-Australian Joint Project was launched in the late 1940s. An area of 270,000 kilometers squared was carved out in the desert of southern Australia, though this was later scaled back to 122,000 kilometers. However, this land wasn't entirely unpopulated. Despite the harsh conditions, many Aboriginal Australian people had lived in the area for generations. They mostly moved in small family groups and came together for celebrations. Their land had already been impacted by European developments, and now they were being moved from it altogether. According to some, not everybody was removed before the testing took place. This was an area the size of a small country, and it's not hard to imagine some families being missed. The impact on these people was devastating. Much of what happened in Woomera is still classified. We do know that conventional rockets weren't the only devices used on the testing range. Between 1956 and 1963, 7 atomic weapons were tested as the UK became the third atomic power. One was twice as powerful as the weapon used in Hiroshima. Other radioactive material was destroyed on the site using conventional weapons, which further polluted the soil with elements like plutonium. One native described being blinded in one test, which he witnessed as a child. He and other members of the community became very sick, with some passing away due to their exposure to radiation. Even those that weren't impacted by the initial blasts would be impacted by the aftermath. Wildlife in the area was dangerous to eat. Kangaroos that were caught would be yellow on the inside. What vegetation that had managed to survive in these harsh conditions of the Australian outback would be completely destroyed. Even today, there are patches of the test range with noticeably less vegetation than areas that were not hit by the blasts. When people were found camping out near craters, not knowing the danger, the main concern of military officers wasn't for their safety, but for the backlash that would come if anything was leaked to the press. Thousands of military personnel were also put in harm's way during the tests, not knowing just how horrific the invisible effects of the nuclear weapons could be. After the Anglo-Australian Joint Project ended, various cleanup operations took place with varying effectiveness. The most recent of these cleanup operations took place in 2000. Officially, radiation levels in the area are now the same as those experienced by people flying on planes. But there are still some critics of how the waste was managed, with contaminated soil and equipment allegedly being buried without anything to stop radioactive material from leaking into surrounding areas. Woomera's dark history would continue after the joint project. The US Armed Forces were the next to take advantage of this designated military space, and it played a key role in the space race. In the 1950s and 60s, Woomera was second only to NASA's Cape Canaveral when it came to how many rockets were being launched. In the 1970s, Woomera would also be home to a joint US-Australian facility. Like Woomera, it accurately described part of what happened at the facility, with antenna dishes that could track rocket launches. It made Woomera a major target for the Soviet Union if World War III were to ever break out. The site was already controversial when it emerged that it had been part of target pinpointing during the Vietnam War. As the Cold War ended, usage of the Woomera Range Complex would slow down, but it remained an important location, as the largest testing area in the Western world. It remains in use today, though not nearly as heavily as it was during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Today, access to the Woomera Range Complex is limited. It remains in the control of the Department of Defense, but different areas can be accessed by the public with special permissions. There is the Woomera Village, which is home to a population of around 300 people who work in support of the site. Visitors are welcome to the village, where there are a number of museums that show some of the history of the testing range. Of course, much remains top secret and might stay that way for decades to come. Beyond that, there are roads and railway lines through the restricted area that are open to the public. However, signs at the side of the road warn users not to stray from the path. They're simply permitted to use the road to get from one side of the testing range to the other, not to explore inside. There are people that live and work in the prohibited areas, though. Parts of the land were returned to the native populations, accounting for roughly 30% of the land in the west of the Woomera Prohibited area. They have the right to restrict access. For example, during the pandemic, travel restrictions were put in place by the community. Elsewhere, there are gold, iron, copper, and opal mines. Workers will spend several weeks on site and 1 week off-site, and may not even be aware of the testing that still takes place elsewhere in the restricted area. Woomera Prohibited area is probably a location that shouldn't be put on anybody's travel bucket list. Number 4. Anybody unfamiliar with the area might be forgiven for thinking that Menwith Hill is some kind of scientific research facility. Giant spheres that resemble golf balls give the impression that they're protecting something inside. But drive past the site on a Tuesday evening, and any visitor would be greeted by protests by the Yorkshire Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, hinting at what really goes on behind the barbed wire fences. RAF Menwith Hill began its life in 1954. The area was once farmland in the scenic moorlands of North Yorkshire. It was part of Nesfield Farm, about 4.3 miles west of Harrogate. But then the British War Office bought 246 acres of the land, later expanding to 562, and closing it off to the public. It remained the property of the British government, but was offered to the US intelligence agencies for whatever purpose they needed. The Cold War wouldn't be one fought with tanks and weaponry. While making sure the opposition knew that you had a well-stocked arsenal was important, more important was the data gathering and spying that went on behind the scenes. Menwith Hill would become the forefront of that. Its position in the UK meant it was able to gather signals from Northern Europe. Specifically, the Soviet Union and its allies were the main targets. Given how rural the area was, there weren't a lot of radio signals coming in from the local population, making it even easier for intelligence gathering to take place. When it was first launched, the focus was on high-frequency radio signals in Eastern Europe, some of which would be transcribed as they were being intercepted. There was no avoiding the public from knowing that something was going on at Menwith Hill. Building the initial station took 3 years and millions of dollars. Over the following decades, improvements would continue to take place. That included the appearance of giant golf balls clearly visible from outside the gates. The strange facility was hard to miss, and even the most uncurious of the population would be asking questions about the base. A cover story was put into place. It was there for rapid radio relay and to conduct communications research. The story didn't stop lots of people from being suspicious, though, and protests have been taking part at the site since at least the 80s. But for a long time, what happened beyond the gates and the warning signs was a mystery. Even today, the full extent of what happens at Menwith Hill remains unknown. The truth about the facility first emerged in 1988, when an investigative journalist named Duncan Campbell was doing research into a surveillance program and discovered that Menwith Hill was part of that. satellite dishes had been installed at the site, which were being used to eavesdrop on private citizens. It's these dishes and satellite receivers that are hidden inside the golf balls, or radomes. The special fabric that makes up the domes is invisible to radio waves, but helps to protect the high-tech equipment from the elements. Today, there are 37 of these radomes on the site. Over the next few decades, more details about the Echelon project would emerge, but it didn't gather much attention outside the local area until 2014. As part of the Snowden leaks, information about Menwith Hill began to be revealed. Today, Menwith Hill is operated largely by the American National Security Agency. The majority of the people working on the base are part of the NSA, with support from various other US and UK agencies. The base wasn't just about work, though. Many civilians have their lives on the base, including family members of the security personnel stationed there. As well as the radomes and surveillance facilities, there's also a bowling alley, a pool hall, a bar, a fast food restaurant, and a general store, all behind the closed gates. But of much more interest to most people wasn't what people were doing in their leisure time. What started out as a facility that could monitor Northern Europe has grown into one of the largest electronic monitoring stations in the world. It covers most of the Eurasian landmass, as well as North Africa and the Middle East. It focuses on all communications that use satellites to connect. At one point, it was feared that fiber optic cables would make the base obsolete, but much of the world still uses satellites to communicate, either over the internet or phones. Intercepted information can be analyzed at the base or passed on to the NSA headquarters in Maryland. For many, it wouldn't be surprising to learn that the facility hadn't stopped growing after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. In fact, as recently as 2019, planning permission for the 3 latest radomes was granted. Between 2009 and 2012, more than $40 million was spent on a new operations building. It would mostly be used as a data center that could store more intercepted communications than before. Also included was a 200-seat capacity auditorium for classified operations meetings. During the height of the Snowden leaks, the majority of the focus for the British public was on the Government Communications Headquarters, or the GCHQ, which many people hadn't even heard of until that point. GCHQ was involved in Menwith Hill, but the focus of attention was on what it had been doing in the UK. What was happening at Menwith Hill could be considered much more dark. Menwith Hill had the capability to identify the locations of specific individuals. It was especially effective in places such as the Middle East. In remote parts of the area where the most dangerous people were suspected of living, fiber optic cables were uncommon, meaning almost all communications were via satellite. The facilities at Menwith Hill were able to identify when and where people used the internet, then contact satellites to take photographs of the area. It meant Menwith Hill would play a crucial role in a lot of operations overseas. Menwith Hill was now more controversial than ever before, but even with the leak, finding out more information has been difficult. Even the members of parliament for local communities have struggled to get answers on the grounds of national security. Unsurprisingly, visiting Menwith Hill, at least beyond the barbed wire fence, is almost impossible. Outside the fence, there are frequent protests, with some protests even including camping in recent years. But even looking in from the outside can lead to questions from the police and being asked to move along. There have been some visits from outsiders to the base, though. For example, the facility has recently started an outreach program and offers work experience schemes for teenagers. There have also been a few visits by local schools who get to see the small American town set up for personnel and their families on the base. Some MPs have been granted permission to the facility, though only on a social basis, and some MPs have been denied access. Those trying to visit the base without special permission will be met by military police and could face imprisonment. Number 3. In the Cypriot capital of Nicosia, roads that run from south to north suddenly stop, cut off by concrete bunkers or border patrol. Despite what the flag of Cyprus looks like, the country and its capital are split in two, bisected by the UN buffer zone. The buffer zone separates the Southern Republic of Cyprus and the Northern Turkish Republic of Cyprus, and is the latest sign of Cyprus's troubled history. Located in the Eastern Mediterranean, Cyprus has been a prize for empires for thousands of years. It went through Egyptian rule, Persian rule and Roman rule all by the 7th century. In the 600s, Romans and Umayyad Caliphate fought over the island and eventually came to an agreement to rule together for some 300 years. Since roughly 1400, there had been a Greek presence on the island, something that was only strengthened when it became part of the Byzantine Empire. It then became a Crusader state and was ruled over by Venice before falling into the hands of the Ottoman Empire in 1570. At a time when most of the biggest powers in the world surrounded the Mediterranean, Cyprus was prized by all of them. There would have been a great deal of fighting during that time and a mixture of Greek and Turkish people living on the island by the 1800s. But after 300 years of Ottoman rule, the Ottoman Empire was becoming weaker and weaker. Britain occupied the island to stop it from falling into Russian hands, but it remained in Ottoman control. It was clear that the arrangement wasn't going to last for long. Greek Cypriots wanted unification with Greece. Turkish Cypriots opposed. The outbreak of the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire only made the situation even more confusing. And soon, Britain found itself with ownership of an island preparing to tear itself apart. The tensions on the island continued to grow after the Second World War. A power-sharing government was put into place when Cyprus gained independence from Great Britain, which lasted less than a decade. Even before it broke down, there was fighting between the two communities in Cyprus. It all bubbled to the surface around Christmas of 1963, when island-wide violence broke out. A few days after Christmas, Major General Peter Young sat with a map of the island. He was the commander of the British Joint Force, who would be in charge of trying to keep the peace on the island. For more than 10 hours, he and others debated where the best place for a partition might be. A green pencil was chosen, as the color didn't have any association with Greece or Turkey, and it was a color typically used to mark fortifications and minefields. That pencil was used to cut the island in two. Many Turkish Cypriots had already moved to the north, possibly in preparation for an independence movement. This line, the Green Line, would become a ceasefire line, patrolled by peacekeeping forces. In 1974, the Turkish invasion of Cyprus began. The Green Line was the point where they could go no further and formed the border between the two countries occupying the island. For almost 50 years, the Green Line, or the UN buffer zone, has remained in place. It stretches the entire length of the island and has a small enclave in the west, an area of the Turkish Republic of Cyprus completely surrounded by the Republic of Cyprus. In places, the buffer zone is 4.6 miles thick. It encompasses entire villages, many of which lie completely abandoned. In other places, like the capital city of Nicosia, it's only a few meters wide. In one place, only a single street separates the two states. For most of the time that it's been in place, the buffer zone has been completely off limits to anybody but UN peacekeepers. Buildings lie abandoned, their contents covered in dust. Homes are still as they were when people were evacuated, with empty cola bottles standing on tables. Advertisements from the 1960s are torn by weather, and animals that call the buffer zone their home but otherwise remain in place. Just 5 miles west of Nicosia lies Nicosia International Airport, and it lies entirely within the exclusion zone. Images of the airport are particularly disturbing, with aircraft left to wear away due to the elements, and waiting areas completely taken over by birds that have made it their home. Much like the exclusion zone around Chernobyl, this is an area where humans were forgotten. It resembles what the world would look like if all humans were to suddenly vanish. Unlike the exclusion zone in Ukraine, however, this forgotten land lies just meters away from busy streets, where people eat at cafes and take photographs under hanging umbrellas. Other places in the exclusion zone wouldn't look too different from how they were when they were occupied. Much of the exclusion zone is farmland and orchards. The farmland became more wild, and animals like foxes and rabbits returned to areas they had previously been kept away from. But otherwise, it would be hard to know that any devastation had taken place to make these lands empty. One of the reasons why the buffer zone was off limits was due to the number of mines in the area. Thousands of mines have been cleared in the decades since, but there are still some areas where traps lie underfoot, just waiting to be set off. As those areas were cleared, though, it became possible for some people to return to their old lands. There are a number of farmers that work the fields inside the buffer zone, and even an entire village that remains inhabited. Here, Green and Turkish Cypriots live and work side by side without issue. But for the time being, the buffer zone seems like it will remain in place. Nicosia is the only partitioned capital in the world. Both sides of the partition hold important parts of Cyprus's history and culture, but they're also very unique and different from one another. In 2003, crossing points opened up between the Republic of Cyprus and the Turkish Republic of Cyprus, a country that is only recognized by Turkey. Crossing between the two areas is normally not a problem, though visitors do need passports to cross through. In times of high tension, crossing can be more restricted. Entering the buffer zone itself is much harder. Special permits can be obtained by the UN peacekeeping force in Cyprus, with different permits for construction, farming, work, and other access. According to the UN FICYP website, school and university groups, academics, researchers, photographers, filmmakers, artists, and others who wish to visit the buffer zone may be permitted to enter on a case-by-case basis. Like other entries on this list, accessing the buffer zone without permission is not only illegal, but it can be dangerous. The UN FICYP website warns that mines do not deactivate over time, and those unfamiliar with the area wouldn't necessarily know where to look out for them. It's possible that even if political tensions in the area were to be resolved, many parts of the buffer zone wouldn't be able to be occupied for years or even decades to come. Number 2. In southern India lies a secret vault that hasn't been opened since at least the 1800s. 5 other vaults have been opened, revealing billions of dollars worth of treasure. But this 6th vault remains a mystery. Even from the outside, the Padmanabha Swami temple is stunning. It dates back to ancient times, with the exact age of the temple remaining a mystery. In literature, between 600 BC and 300 CE, it was described as being made of gold, indicating it was already well known for its wealth and beauty at the time. It's been renovated many times over the centuries. The temple is a Hindu temple dedicated to a specific avatar of the god of Vishnu. Over thousands of years that it's existed, worshippers have come to donate treasure to the god. The temple and the treasure beneath it belong to Vishnu and are managed by the royal house of Travancore. Donations made by both the royal family and others were stored in vaults hidden beneath the temple. Some of the vaults would be regularly opened, and the treasures would be displayed at various festivals. But 2 of the vaults remained closed for more than 100 years. By 2011, there were concerns about the treasure. It was thought that there had been some mismanagement of the temple and that some of the treasure may have gone missing. The Supreme Court of India ordered that the vaults be opened and an audit take place. Auditors found the 6 vaults beneath the temple. They were given the names Vault A through F. C through F were the ones that were opened regularly enough, and there was no problem getting in there. Beautiful relics were uncovered and audited before being placed back into their proper places. Vault A was harder. It was possibly opened in the 1930s, but it may have been closed for much longer. A massive granite block stood in front of the door to Vault A and took 7 people to move. Fresh air was pumped into the room so that auditors would be able to breathe. What they uncovered was amazing. This was where the majority of the treasure uncovered so far was hidden. Many of the wooden boxes that had once held the gold and jewels had disintegrated over the years, leaving the contents to spill out across the chamber. Even once the chamber was opened, there were some objections from priests over the auditing of some of the artifacts, and the full list of what was uncovered hasn't been made available. We do know that hundreds of gold coins, some from as far away as Rome, were in the chamber. Pure gold chains up to 18 feet long were uncovered. Statues of Vishnu, a solid gold throne, crowns, and other jewelry are some of the artifacts that are known to have been cataloged. All this was the treasure that had been donated to the temple over thousands of years. It was valued at roughly $22 billion US, which didn't take into account the historical importance of the artifacts. The vault was opened only for the purpose of auditing these artifacts. Once a note was made of them, they were wrapped in cloth and put in new boxes. The room was then sealed again. Then came Vault B. Vault B had 3 doors. The first was a metal grill and opened easily enough. The second was a wooden door that required a key. Due to the ruling of the Supreme Court, the royal family handed over the keys to the vault, and the wooden door was opened. The final door was made from iron, which could not be opened. By now, there are many legends about this door. Some say that there was no opening mechanism anywhere around the door. 2 snakes are carved into the door and are said to be guarding it from any trespassers. Anybody who tries to force their way into the room may be met with a curse, which may even be spread to all of India. According to one story, a worker trying to open the door heard the sound of rushing water on the other side. Believing the sea lay on the other side of the door, he left and would not try again. Legend says that the door is sealed with a special spell or mantra. Those that try to explain the spell with science claim an exact frequency must be met for the door to be open. And if someone tries the wrong spell or does not match the correct frequency and tries to open the door, it will remain sealed. Nobody alive today has the religious knowledge and the correct frequency to be able to open the door, and so it must remain sealed. The truth of the matter may be much less mystical, but the room remains extremely mysterious. The final door to Vault B is made of iron and has 3 locks. The royal family handed over the keys to these locks, as they had done the keys to the other locks. However, over time, one of these locks has become so rusted that it could not be opened. After many failed attempts to get the lock open, the mission was abandoned. There were plans to find a locksmith or someone with metal cutting tools who'd be able to get into the vault. This was a step too far for the temple management. They went to the court and got an injunction to stop the plan from being carried out. As much as many people are curious about what lies beyond the door to Vault B, it's still a religious site. The vault also lies beneath the main sanctum. Not only was it very sacred, but there were also fears that doing anything to damage the door might damage other parts of the temple. With modern technology, it's physically possible to open the 3rd door to Vault B, though it's unlikely anybody will be permitted to do so for the foreseeable future. What lies beyond the door remains a mystery. Vault A contained more treasures than any of the other vaults that have been opened so far. If Vault B really hasn't been opened since the 1800s, as is believed, it may contain even more treasure. With the site so old, it would be reckless to completely brush off stories of curses, though. The fact of the matter is, we don't know what will happen when that door is open, and it may be better if we don't find out. Number 1. Before the 1900s, bronze was used on and off as pastoral land, but was unoccupied when Frederick Loeffler was looking for a new location to set up a laboratory in 1910. At the turn of the 20th century, scientists had a relatively good understanding of how diseases spread through bacteria, but there were still some diseases that couldn't be explained. A new filter was invented with holes smaller than bacteria. With some diseases, this filter removed the disease entirely from infected liquids, but other diseases were caused by something that could pass through even this filter. There was something smaller than bacteria that was spreading these illnesses. The word virus had already been coined, but what exactly this wasn't clear. Some hypotheses were that they were a substance excreted by bacteria, while another theory was that they were some kind of life form smaller than bacteria. It was as scientists were trying to understand this that Frederick and Paul Frosch were studying foot and mouth disease. Foot and mouth disease infects mostly cloven-hooved animals like cows and other farm animals. It's very rare that the disease can be spread to humans, but that doesn't mean its impact isn't devastating to farmers. It causes high fevers, blisters around the mouth and hooves, and significant weight loss. It also spreads rapidly through livestock and can be introduced by wild animals or even farming equipment that carries the virus. It wasn't until Frederick and Paul began studying the disease that anybody realized it was viral. It was determined not to be a bacteria, but that mysterious other substance. As Frederick came to understand that, he earned the title of a founder of virology. These studies were taking place in northeast Germany. Unsurprisingly, an outbreak of foot and mouth disease occurred, and the scientists were asked to move their research. The nearby island of Rans seemed like the perfect location. It was close enough to the mainland that Frederick and his fellow scientists could travel there, but there was little chance of any viruses or other diseases traveling between the lab and any farms. In 1910, the first laboratory on the island was set up, complete with a stable for large animals. The mission wasn't just to understand how the virus worked, but to learn early warning signs, animal behavior, and ultimately create a vaccine for the disease. Work was slow at first. 3 years after the laboratory was set up, Frederick was assigned the role of director of the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin, and his research into the disease had to be limited. Then the First World War came, putting a stop to the research entirely. After the war, other scientists continued Frederick's research on Ron's Island, and a vaccine was finally created. By this point, the laboratory on the island was becoming well known as a center for studying diseases. Before long, it wasn't just foot and mouth disease that was being studied, but other viruses that affect animals. The island's isolation meant that there was little risk of these diseases being spread, other than by humans, so it was one of the few places in the world where the diseases could even be studied. During the war, the site designated to make the world a safer place was turned into the exact opposite, as the German military looked into ways to use diseases in war efforts. Thankfully, after the war, it was returned to its original purpose. Over the decades, the number of people working on the site has grown and shrunk depending on the needs. Today, it has 7 different facilities across Germany, but it's at Ron's that 7 of the 12 institutes are based. Today, the diseases studied on the island include everything from rabies to influenza. The focus is on animal diseases. Not only can animal diseases be devastating to farmers and the animals themselves, but it's often diseases that carry over from animals to humans that are the most dangerous for humans. Ron's is one of only 3 laboratories in the world that are able to study the impact of these diseases on large animals, the others being in Winnipeg in Canada and Geelong in Australia. As such, there are many areas that house between 80 and 100 alpacas, boars, cows, goats, and sheep. But it isn't only large animals that the scientists of Ron's study. Diseases that impact fish, mollusks, crustaceans, and bees are all being studied. As the world learned in recent years, it's impossible to know where the next viral disease might come from. So understanding some of the less famous diseases that impact smaller animals is just as important as those that the average person might have heard of. When it comes to laboratories like this, there's no such thing as being too careful. For example, in 2007, a faulty pipe at Prohibited Institute for Animal Health in the UK led to the virus that causes foot and mouth disease being spread to nearby farms, causing multiple outbreaks. There are a number of precautions that are in place to stop these diseases from escaping Ron's. There's only one way on and off the island. A dam was built in 1970, connecting the island to the mainland, but the dam can be shut off at any time in case of an outbreak. Anybody trying to sneak onto the island by boat would find that the entire facility is surrounded by impenetrable walls and barbed wire. Upon arrival, scientists and other staff at the facility must take a disinfecting shower. In high-security buildings, hazmat suits are worn, complete with filtered air through a hose. Airlocks preventing anything in the air from getting through any cracks and doors. Even airflow is monitored. Once staff are ready to leave the island, they must again take disinfecting showers before re-entering the rest of society. It's hard to overstate the importance of these measures. We need facilities like this so we can properly understand viruses and prevent outbreaks in the future. The creation of effective vaccines for foot and mouth disease has turned what's a relatively common occurrence into something rare. But the existence of these facilities could be a launchpad for the diseases if the measures aren't put into place. The lab on Ron's is one of only 59 biosecurity level 4 labs in the world, meaning the diseases that are studied here are some of the most dangerous on the planet. An outbreak could be devastating for the entire world. This is one forbidden place that's forbidden not only for your safety, but for everyone's. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.